Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. I think I'm going to change things up in this episode a little bit. Instead of focusing on the pandemic, we're going to take a quick look at how morality seems to be changing across the Western world. So we're going to be taking a look at an article here from the New York Post titled Utah State Senate Votes Unanimously to Decriminalize Polygamy. This is part of the inevitable outcome from the Obergefell ruling. Once you have opened up the barn door, the horse gets out of the barn, and closing the barn door once the horse is out does no good whatsoever. So just like many people warned and what they were told was a slippery slope argument, the definitions of what counts as marriage and what does not are ruptured completely and totally. There is no putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. So for better or worse, whether you love it or hate it, this is just inevitable. This is the way that it is. But a bit of warning and caution: if you look down the road at other things that are possibly shortly to follow after this over the next 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, we're actually going to be going into some really dangerous territory. And I don't think I have to point out what that is or define it. Hopefully you can guess for yourself. So here's this article from February 19th of this year. Utah State Senate voted unanimously to decriminalize polygamy, hoping to make it an infraction on a par with a parking ticket. In other words, police probably wouldn't do anything about it at all. There's not going to be any prosecutions for any of this. It's just done. The bill swiftly cleared the Republican-controlled Senate in the predominantly Mormon state with a vote of 29-0 with little discussion on Tuesday, and now moves to the Utah House of Representatives, where it is likely to face greater resistance. However, as we shall see, not very much at all, actually. Polygamy is currently classified as a third-degree felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. If the Senate bill becomes law, punishments would be limited to fines of up to $750 and community service. However, fraudulent bigamy, in which an individual obtains licenses to marry more than one spouse without their knowledge or seeks to wed someone underage without her consent, would remain a felony. But of course, there will be massive violations of this due to the changes in the polygamy statutes. But the real danger zone we have here is this: the wedding of someone underage with or without consent. I'm not sure why the without the consent part even matters, because underage people by definition cannot consent. The article goes on to point out here that there are some 30,000 people living in polygamous communities in the state of Utah, and this sort of thing has been popularized by the TLC show Sister Wives. And I'll move from that to an article in the Salt Lake Tribune. Removing polygamy as a felony is one of the important laws that take effect today. So it actually did pass through both the Senate and the House. Their marriages carried a felony charge punishable by up to 5 years in prison for most of Utah's history, but after a new law decriminalizing polygamy among consenting adults takes effect Tuesday, plural marriages are now considered an infraction, an offense less than some traffic tickets, and a historic shift in how the state regards the practice. And of course, as one state goes, so may go the rest of the country, if anyone files lawsuits over this sort of thing. The bill ran into some opposition during the legislative session among groups opposed to polygamy, who said the practice is inherently abusive to women and children and argued that the penalties should not be lessened. So although they point out here that the bill does not completely legalize polygamy, it does drop the penalties so low that most people aren't going to be concerned with it. There remain penalties under the new law for polygamy in conjunction with other crimes, such as fraud or abuse or domestic violence and human smuggling. But unfortunately here the article does not address those who are underage, which is something that has been problematic in Utah for a very long time. Here we take a look at another article from the Salt Lake Tribune where polygamy opponents see lessening of penalties as the latest sign Utah does not want to help them. And as it points out here under this file photo, members of Tapestry of Polygamy, Rowana Erickson Left, Laura Chapman, Vicky Prunty, and Carmen Thompson held a news conference outside Governor Michael Leavitt's office back in 1998 to gain support in their fight to prosecute bigamy and related civil rights abuses in Utah. So they were already not really prosecuting these things as far back as 1998. And this article points out that there are many people who see this as an example of the patriarchy, where women are inherently abused by being in such relationships, and that the law is not on their side. It does not recognize these as legal relationships, so that if they try to divorce the person or leave, they are entitled to no ordinary and familiar benefits that would follow from other marriages. However, the bigger picture from this that people should be starting to see is that since the state of California has mandated that children learn about polyamory, that is, all kinds of polygamous and polyandry and so on, other types of relationships, these are things that are going to become increasingly common, especially if they are given the imprimatur of no legal punishments. And as this paragraph points out here, this really does open the door to all kinds of different legal issues. It says here, quote, "More social services would be great," said Doris Hanson, who grew up in the polygamous Davis County Cooperative Society, also known as the Kingston Group or The Order, and hosts the online anti-polygamy program Polygamy, What Love Is This? But she believes Utah needs law enforcement dedicated to pursuing crimes like sex abuse or fraud within polygamy. And I move from there to an article in The American Interest related to religious freedom by Peter Berger that is titled "From Mormon Polygamy to the LGBT Community." And here he is trying to bridge the gap between the LGBTQ plus community and Mormons by pointing out that, quote, "Americans were sexually innovative long before the 1960s. Just consider the Mormons." And this article, I will have it linked below so that you can check it out for yourself. He goes on to point out that the LGBTQ plus community has had a number of problems with the idea of polygamy, especially the religious form of Mormon polygamy, because they do see it as discrimination and as inherently harmful to females. And the way that this author tries to pull this into an area of concern for the LGBTQ plus community is to say, hey, look at these people. They were discriminated against just as you were. Therefore, you can see one another as some form of allies. He points out here in this paragraph, whatever has changed in America since 1878, what has not changed is the propensity of the Supreme Court to plunge into complex moral issues. He goes on to point out here in this final paragraph on the page that you're looking at now, the court opened the floodgates again in 2015 with Obergefell versus Hodges, which declared same-sex marriage to be a constitutional right. And he is right here that the floodgates have been opened with that, although it will take a lot of time for these things to play out. And overall, I would say this is a rather disturbing article, but you should see where all of these things inevitably come from. If, for example, you would get this book by Dr. Benjamin Weicker, Moral Darwinism, How We Became Hedonists, he explains the entire change in Western society from the pre-Christian paganism that we see coming back today to the changes instituted by Christianity, its rise and fall, and then inevitably many of the things that we're seeing play out now. As he points out in the book, what we're getting back today is the entire suite of ancient ethics. This would be pre-Christian paganistic ethics where, as he says here, abortion, euthanasia, infanticide, and sexual promiscuity are simply the norm. That would, of course, also include plural marriage or Obergefell-type marriages. All of these things were broadly accepted in the past. In the blurb here, which I'll read, it says, "Ideas and actions once unthinkable have become commonplace. We seem to live in a different moral universe than we occupied just a few decades ago. Consent and non-coercion seem to be the last vestiges of a morality long left behind. Christian moral tenets are now easily dismissed and have been replaced with what is curiously presented as a superior, more magnanimous, respectful, and even humble morality. How did we end up so far away from where we began? Can the decline be stopped?" And yes, as a Christian, he does see this as moral degeneracy. Ben Weicker, in this provocative and insightful book, traces the amazing story that explains our present cultural situation. Weicker finds the roots of our moral slide reaching all the way back to the ethical theory and atheistic cosmology of the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. And that philosophy, of course, would be atomism, which goes back to Democritus before Epicurus. Christian teaching had been in contention with this worldview long before it reached its pinnacle with the rise and acceptance of Darwinism. But it was Darwinism, Weicker contends, that provided this ancient teaching with a seemingly modern and scientific basis that captured 20th century minds. Weicker demonstrates that this ancient atomistic and materialistic philosophy supplies the guiding force behind Darwinism and powerfully propels the hedonistic bent of our society while promoting itself under the guise of pure science. And he does show in this book that these things are almost inevitable outcomes of materialistic assumptions about the world. Things do tend towards this hedonism that he talks about, and towards a morality of utilitarianism, where the idea is that everything should be oriented around the so-called greatest good for the greatest number. But of course, it never really identifies what that greatest good is. And ultimately, all too many times, that boils down to some sort of simplistic formulation of pleasure. But it is an absolutely fantastic book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. And of course, I'll have this link below for anyone interested in purchasing it. And you can get it pretty cheap here. A used copy is just about $4. You can't really beat that for something that is as such interesting and good philosophical and historical reading as this. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.